Understanding the 5 principles and applying them properly is absolutely fundamental when it comes to any assessment of mental capacity. Get it right and you're well on your way to a successful assessment. Get it wrong and you can find yourself in a whole world of trouble. So, in this video, I'm going to explain what each of the principles mean, both individually and actually how they sit together as a whole. So just up here, you can see the 5 principles as outlined by the Mental Capacity Act. Now in the Act, they use specific phrasing, but quite often as laymen, as professionals, we shorten those and use slightly different phrases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to each one of them in the more colloquial language. I'm going to start with the first one, the presumption of capacity. I want to give you a scenario. You walk into a solicitor's office and you sit down, and before you've opened your mouth, they say, well, I'm terribly sorry, we don't think you've got capacity. How would you feel? Tell you it was me. I'll be right round off. I'll be really, really cross. How dare somebody make that assumption that I lack capacity before they even met me, before I've even been allowed to say my piece? I suspect you're the same. And so, if that goes for you and it goes for me, surely that should go for everyone. And that is where I believe this whole presumption of capacity comes from. Now, one of the things we've got to be really careful with is that we don't sit there and go, oh, well, I'm presuming capacity, therefore I don't have to do anything. The presumption of capacity is not an excuse to do nothing. So that if we feel there may be an issue of capacity, we can't hide behind the presumption. We can't say, oh, I'm presuming capacity, therefore they do nothing. We have to act on it and do something. So how do we overturn this presumption? What are we looking for that makes us go, okay, I'm not hiding behind the presumption, I'm going to do something about it? Now, there's something called the balance of probabilities. And to me, it's one of the vaguest legal terms I've ever heard. And what it means is you cut your brain in half and 51% or more of it thinks what? And so when it comes to overturning the presumption of capacity, when it comes to actually trying to determine capacity as a whole, we're not looking for 100% cast iron. We're looking for that 51% of your more of your brain that says what. So when it comes to overturning this presumption of capacity, you need to be sitting there going, does 51% of my brain have doubt? Because if it does, I need to do something about it. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, where does that doubt come from? What qualifies that? Well, we're looking for evidence, right? We're looking for evidence that capacity might not exist. And that evidence might be they have a loss of memory. They might be poor concentration. There might be something in their actions. So they might be saying one thing and doing something else and not realising that there's a disparity. But one of the other key things about this presumption then is that the onus is not on the individual to prove that they have capacity. The onus is on the person challenging them to demonstrate that they don't have capacity. Now, when it comes to assessments, that can sometimes be quite difficult because in theory, somebody could say nothing in the assessment and you've got to come away from that and go, well, actually, what do I think? Is there evidence here to overturn the presumption? Do I need to be moving forward? And that's when we start to look at this outside evidence. It might be third-party evidence from family members. It might be, this disparity. So important thing to remember is even though we start with the presumption, it's not to be hidden behind. If you have a niggle, find out where that niggle comes from. And then if necessary, if 51% or more of your brain thinks that there might be a concern around capacity, there might be lacking capacity, then you need to do something about it. So that then leads us on to principle 2. This is sometimes known as supported decision making. And what the Act tells us is that we have to make all practicable steps to support the individual before we can determine whether they have capacity or not. Now, what does this support look like? Well, it might be just simply providing them with information. People often say to me, but Tim, is it okay for me to give information to people during assessment? Of course it is. Imagine you went to see a solicitor and it was around a will or buying a house. And you walked in and you sat down. You would expect the solicitor to give you some information. If they just sat there and said nothing, you'd be like, what's going on? So again, if you would expect to be given information before you make a decision, surely that goes for everybody. Now, how we go about supporting people changes depending on the individual, depending on the situation. But invariably, it means that we as assessors need to be incredibly creative. Let me give you an example. I was once asked to see a gentleman in relation to a will. the legal test to make a will in the UK, something called Banks versus Goodfellow. And briefly, it says, in order to make a will, you've got to know 4 things, right? You've got to know what a will is. You've got to know what you've got to give away. You want to know who might want a piece of your pie, and then how you're going to divide it up. So I was sat with this gentleman, and he knew what he had to give away. He knew who he wanted to give it to. But when it came to dividing it up, because of the brain injury, he was really struggling to conceptualise what that might mean. And I noticed on his table in front of him, he had a big tin full of chocolate. And so I tipped them out on his table and said, "This is your estate. Now, let's divide that up." I said to him, "Of all these chocolates, what would you like to give your mum?" He picked up a Twix and he put it down. I should say other chocolates are available, depending, obviously, where you shop. I said, "Okay, so we're gonna give that to your mum. Now, would you like to give your dad more or less than you've given your mum?" He said, "Actually the same." So I was like, "Okay." So he took another Twix bar and he put it down. I said, "Right, I'm aware you've got children. How much would you like to leave your daughter?" He said, "More than my dad, more than my mum." He picked up one of these, these really big Galaxy bars. He picked up one of those and he put them down. Said, "Okay, is that just for one daughter, or is that for both your daughters?" He said, that's for one daughter. I said, "Okay, so your other daughter, how much would you like to give them?" He said, "I'd like to give her the same." So he picked up another big bar. I then said to him, "I'm aware that you're recently divorced. Would you like to give your ex-wife anything?" He failed to do. Picked up a Malteser. I was like, "There you are. You can have that much." Put it down. We then talked about friends and other people, and using other chocolate bars, and that we were able to map it out. And so using that, I then took a photograph. We then went and worked out with the solicitors what the different percentages were. We then went back to the guy and we worked with him, and he could then understand it, and he could then make a will. So you can see it's about being inventive. It's about how can I best support this individual. Now, I've done that technique. I've done it with tea bags. I've done it with bits of jigsaws, all sorts of things. Another way you can support people, certainly those that are non-verbal, is by using what we call open and closed questions. Now, invariably when we talk to assess, right, people say use open questions. So, ask them, what does that mean? But of course, if somebody's non-verbal, they're really going to struggle to be able to do that. And one really useful technique I've found, if people can give me a binary yes or no, is to ask them questions that require a yes or no answer. But how do I do that in a way that's not leading? Well, let me give you another example. I was once asked to assess a gentleman, again around a will, but he could only indicate yes by looking up and no by looking down. Completely non-verbal, no other movement in it. So I said to him, "Do you know what a will is?" And he looked up for yes. Now, as I asked him, I was sitting there thinking, well, do you actually know what a will is, or are you thinking it's about taking your car to a garage? So I asked him, I said, "Is a will about taking your car to the garage?" He looked down for no. I said, "Okay, is it about appointing people you trust to make decisions about your health and welfare?" He looked down for no. So is it a legal document that outlines what you want to leave to people when you die? He looked up for yes. So you see, even though he couldn't tell me, by structuring my questions in a certain way, by asking them in these option questions, if you like, I was able to support him to communicate his decision. So supporting decision making is really, really crucial. And actually, as part of your planning, this is definitely one of the key things you want to be spending time on and thinking about, well, what do I need to do to be able to support this person to be able to make this decision? We now come on to principle 3. This is sometimes called unwise decisions. Now, what the Act tells us is that a person is allowed to make an unwise decision, okay? And just because they make an unwise decision doesn't mean they lack capacity. Now, I'm sure you can all give me an example of an unwise decision. And please don't say watching this video. But it becomes more difficult when we start to say, can you give me a definition? Now, for me, when it comes to defining an unwise decision, there are 2 key things I look for. One is an understanding and appreciation of the risks or the consequences involved of either taking or not taking that decision. And the second thing is there a series of steps that takes them from that body of evidence to the outcome? Now, that series of steps has to be a logical or sequential flow. In psychiatry, we have something called night move thinking, and this harks back to chess. So for those of you that play chess, you'll know that all the pieces, apart from the knight, move in a straight line, either forwards, backwards, left, right, or diagonally. And the piece they end up on, there is a direct straight line to that point. Now, the only piece that doesn't move like that is the knight. It moves forward 3 and across 2. So that the piece it lands on, there is no direct line back to where it started. And one of the things we look for when we're trying to see if somebody's making an unwise decision is there a logical flow from that body of evidence to the outcome? Or is it that knight's move thinking, where the outcome they end up with is not related to the evidence they started from? We then move on to principle 4. Now, this is often called best interests. And what the Act says is, if somebody lacks capacity and you have to make a decision on their behalf, it has to be in their best interests. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go into depth around subjugated decision making and all that sort of thing. And maybe I'll do that in a different video. But it's suffice to understand that if you have to make a decision on somebody else's behalf, it has to be in their best interest. Now, if you ever have to present this in court, what the court will ask you to do is to list the various options, and then under each option say what the pros and the cons of that particular option are. You know, almost like in three kind of columns. So, for example, let's say somebody was leaving hospital, and the option might be to go home, might be to go to a care home, might be to stay with a relative. So the courts would expect you to go, right, what are the pros and the cons of going home? So what are the benefits? What are the risks? What are the pros and cons of going into the care home? What are the pros and cons of going to live with a relative? And then at the bottom of each of those columns, they'd expect you to weigh and balance those up and say, okay, well, that and that make this. And then at the end, once you've done that for all three, you're then able to make that decision to go, actually, of those three, I think going to live with a relative, for example, is the best one because of this combination of factors, as opposed to that combination of factors with the others. It's important to understand as well that just because you come to one conclusion with one person, somebody else facing that exact same series of options may actually have a different outcome as their best interest. Finally, we come on to the last principle, which is often called the less restrictive. This can sometimes be confused with the least restrictive. Basically, what the principle is saying is that if you make a decision on behalf of somebody else, it has to have the minimal possible impact on their rights and freedoms. And that's why we talk about less restrictive rather than least restrictive, because arguably the least restrictive is to have no restrictions at all. Let me give you another example. Imagine we've got 3 people in a care home, okay? Now the first person has dementia and they wander. Now this care home has been unfortunately built right next to a motorway, where you open the front doors, you walk out straight onto the motorway. So the first person wanders. If they're not careful, they'll walk straight on them. So for the first person, the less restrictive option is to keep the doors shut and locked. Now, the second person, they also suffer with what we call sundowning. Now, that means that at night, they become more confused. So at night, they need to have medication as well. So for them, the less restrictive option is the closed doors and the medication. Now, the third patient also can't keep themselves in bed at night. They fall out onto the floor and they're at danger of fracturing and severely injuring themselves. So for them, the less restrictive is the cot sides and the medication for their sundown and the closed doors. So you can see that with the less restrictive, it's about what's the minimum amount of restrictions that we need to apply to keep someone safe. Now, if we go back to that original chart of the 5 principles, we can actually separate them out into different areas. So you see the first 2, the presumption of capacity and supported decision making, can be applied to everyone. The third one, unwise decisions, only applies if you have capacity, right? You can only make an unwise decision if you have capacity. The other 2, so the best interest and the less restrictive, only apply if you've lost capacity. And that's really important because quite often I will see a report that says, we think this person has capacity, but we're going to have a best interest meeting. You can't do that. If they have capacity, they have to be allowed to make the decisions, even if you don't agree with it. So I hope this video has been useful. I hope you now have a good understanding of the principles, about kind of what underpins them, where they come from, how you can start to apply them in practice. If you have enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe below. If you would like me to talk about any other specific topics, then please do let me know below. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you very much.